The emergency alarm blared through Research Station Gamma 7, pulling Dr. Sarah Chen away from her microscope. Red lights flashed in the sterile white hallways as she rushed toward the docking bay. As the station's lead xenobiologist, any unexpected arrival required her immediate attention. Status report. She called out to the station's eye. Unknown vessel. Crystalline structure detected. Life signs critical. The AI responded in its calm voice. Sarah's heart raced. Crystalline structure meant only one thing. A Valkyrn ship. The proud warrior race rarely ventured into human space, and never alone. Something was very wrong. As the airlock cycled, Sarah grabbed her medical scanner. The inner doors opened with a hiss, revealing a sight that made her gasp. A tall figure stumbled through, her crystalline body catching the emergency lights and sending red reflections across the walls. Where the alien's exoskeleton should have been smooth and perfect, it was cracked and failing. "Help," the Valkyrn warrior managed to say before collapsing. Her voice, usually filled with the famous Valkyrn pride, sounded weak and broken. Sarah rushed forward, her scanner already working. "Get me a hover stretcher. And call Dr. Martinez to the med bay immediately." The fallen warrior was quickly transported to the medical bay. Under the bright lights, Sarah could see the full extent of the damage. The Valkyrn's purple-tinted crystalline form was spider-webbed with cracks. Small pieces were beginning to fall away. "I am Kythera," the warrior spoke softly as Sarah worked. "Crown Princess of the Valkyrn Empire." Sarah nearly dropped her scanner. "The Crown Princess? Here. Your Highness, what happened to you?" "Assassination attempt." Kythera's voice was bitter. "Quantum destabilizer. They broke my core structure." Dr. James Martinez arrived then, his usually calm face showing concern as he saw their patient. "A Valkyrn. Here." "Not just any Valkyrn," Sarah said. "The Crown Princess." James immediately began checking the readings on the medical displays. His dark eyes widened at what he saw. "This is bad. The damage is at a molecular level." Kythera let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it held no joy. "Yes, bad enough that I came here, to humans, for help." "But why us specifically?" Sarah asked, still running scans. "Surely the Empire has better medical facilities." "They cannot help me." Kythera's crystalline hand clenched. "Our healing methods require perfect crystal structure. Mine is too damaged. There is only one way now." She seemed to struggle with the words. "I need a genetic bond." Both doctors froze. The Valkyrn genetic bond was legendary, a process where a dominant Valkyrn would bind themselves to a mate, sharing strength and life force. But it was always the Valkyrn who was dominant, who ruled over their mate. "Our research shows humans are compatible," Kythera continued. "The only compatible species we found." But she trailed off, her pride clearly warring with her desperate situation. "But," James prompted gently, "but the bond requires submission from me." The words seemed to cause Kythera physical pain. "In my weakened state, I cannot be dominant. I would have to submit, to beg a human male to be my mate." Sarah looked at James, then back at Kythera. The princess of an empire that saw humans as barely civilized now needed one of them to save her life. But it would mean giving up everything her culture valued. Dominance, control, pride. "How long?" Sarah asked. 3 Earth days at most," Kythera replied. "Then my core structure will fail completely." She looked at James, and for the first time, there was fear in her crystalline eyes. Will you at least consider it?" James met her gaze steadily, his expression thoughtful. The fate of a princess, and perhaps an empire, now rested in his hands. The question was, what would he do with that power? Kythera sat on the edge of her medical bed, her crystalline form catching the light and sending fractured rainbows across the walls. The cracks in her body had spread further, despite Dr. Chen's best efforts to stabilize her condition. She watched Dr. James Martinez work at his console, her purple eyes narrowed with a mixture of desperation and disgust. "Human," she called out, her voice carrying the echo common to her species. "Come here." James looked up from his work but didn't immediately move. "I have a name, Your Highness. It's Dr. Martinez, or James if you prefer." Thera's crystal face flickered with anger. Even dying, she struggled with the idea of showing respect to a human. "Very well, Dr. Martinez. We must discuss the bonding." "Must we?" James continued his work, his fingers moving steadily across the holographic keyboard. "From what I've seen, you can barely stand to look at me." A small crystal shard fell from Thera's arm, making her flinch. "You don't understand. I am royalty. The very idea of submitting to someone like you." "Someone like me?" James finally turned to face her fully. "You mean someone who's trying to save your life? Someone who spent the last 12 hours researching ways to help you?" Sarah, who had been quietly monitoring Thera's vital signs, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should all take a break. The stress isn't helping your condition, Your Highness." "I don't have time for breaks." Thera stood up suddenly, then swayed as her weakened legs struggled to support her. James moved instinctively to steady her, but she jerked away from his touch. The sudden movement caused more crystals to fall from her body. "You're making it worse," James said softly. "Your pride is literally killing you." Thera sank back onto the bed. "You think this is easy. In my culture, we bond only with those who prove themselves stronger. We do not beg. We do not submit." "And in my culture," James replied, "we judge people by their actions and character, not their species or status." He picked up one of her fallen crystals and held it up to the light. "You know what I see when I look at this? I see something beautiful that's been damaged, yes, but also something that could be reformed into something new. Maybe even something stronger." For the first time, Thera looked at him with something other than disdain. "You understand crystal formation. I've studied your species extensively. Did you think humans were just ignorant savages?" James placed the crystal carefully in a scanner. "We've learned a lot about your biology. Enough to know that this bond you're talking about isn't just about dominance and submission. It's about compatibility, resonance, harmony." Thera watched as he pulled up complex diagrams of Valkyrn crystal structures. You've done research on us. For years. Your species fascinates me." James showed her the scanner results. "See these patterns? They're like music written in crystal. But right now, your song is out of tune. The bond wouldn't be about submission, Thera. It would be about finding the right harmony." Sarah smiled slightly as she watched the exchange. The princess's expression had shifted from contempt to curiosity. "But you still haven't said if you would consider it," Thera said quietly. "Being my mate." James turned to face her fully. "I'll consider it when you can ask me without looking like you're swallowing poison. When you can see me as a person, not just a human. When you understand that any bond between us would have to be a partnership, not a power struggle." He turned back to his work, leaving Thera to stare at his back, her crystal face reflecting a storm of emotions. For the first time in her life, a lesser being had set terms for her, and for the first time, she found herself wondering if perhaps her people's definition of lesser needed to change. The space station's alarms blared for the second time that week. This time, however, the warning was more serious. "Multiple Valkyrn ships detected," the AI announced. "They are armed and their weapons are powered." Sarah rushed to Thera's room, finding the princess trying to stand despite her weakening condition. More crystals had fallen from her body, leaving gaps in her once beautiful form. "Your people?" Sarah asked, helping Thera stay upright. "The Royal Guard," Thera's voice was filled with fear. "They've come to take me home, to die with dignity rather than shame our empire." James burst into the room. 3 warships. They're demanding we hand over the princess." "You have to hide me," Thera grabbed James's arm, no longer caring about touching a human. They'll kill you if they think you've tried to bond with me. James looked at the hand on his arm, then at Cathera's face. I have a better idea. Do you trust me? Cathera hesitated for only a moment. Yes. Sarah, get her to the inner lab. I'll handle this. James turned to leave, but Cathera caught his arm again. They are elite warriors, she warned. The finest fighters in the Empire. James smiled. Good thing I'm not planning to fight them. The station's docking bay soon filled with tall, crystalline warriors, their bodies glowing with power. Their leader, Commander Varrock, stood nearly 8 feet tall, her crystal form pulsing with angry red light. Where is our princess? Varrock demanded when James met them. In our medical bay, James replied calmly. She's receiving treatment. Treatment? Varrock laughed coldly. From humans, step aside. Little male. We will retrieve her ourselves. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. James stood his ground. She's under quarantine. The warriors stopped. In a species made of living crystal, infection was taken very seriously. Explain, Varrock demanded. We discovered a quantum resonance virus in her system. James lied smoothly, knowing the warriors wouldn't understand the science. It's why her crystal structure is failing. If you take her now, you risk infecting your entire crew. You dare to stop us with tricks. Varrock raised her weapon. James tapped his tablet, bringing up complex diagrams on the station's holographic displays. These are the virus patterns. Feel free to scan them yourself. But I should warn you, even scanning risks transmission. The warriors looked uncertainly at their commander. James pressed his advantage. Of course, we're developing a cure. That's why the princess came to us. Our quantum stabilization research is the most advanced in known space. But we need at least 3 more days. Varrock's crystal face shifted colors as she considered. You lie. Scan her then, James shrugged. But remember, if your entire crew becomes infected, who will protect the Empire? Who will tell your queen that you risked the royal guard on pride alone? The warriors shifted uncomfortably. Their commander glared at James, who met her gaze without flinching. Finally, Varrock lowered her weapon. 3 days, human. If our princess is not cured by then, we will return, and no clever words will save you. After the warriors left, James found Cathera and Sarah in the inner lab. Thera stared at him in amazement. You outmaneuvered them, she whispered, without violence, without strength, just words and wisdom. Sometimes the strongest weapon is knowing what your opponent fears, James replied. They were so afraid of appearing weak, they never questioned the science. Thera reached out and touched his face, her crystal fingers cool against his skin. I begin to understand why the old stories warn us about humans, not because you are weak, but because your strength is different from ours, harder to fight, harder to resist. James took her hand gently. We have 3 days now. Time enough for you to decide if that's the kind of strength you want by your side. Thera looked at their joined hands, crystal and flesh, so different yet somehow fitting together. Perhaps I already have. The space station's alarms blared for the 2nd time that week. This time, however, the warning was more serious. Multiple Valkyr ships detected, the AI announced. They are armed, and their weapons are powered. Sarah rushed to Cathera's room, finding the princess trying to stand despite her weakening condition. More crystals had fallen from her body, leaving gaps in her once beautiful form. Your people? Sarah asked, helping Cathera stay upright. The royal guard, Cathera's voice was filled with fear. They've come to take me home, to die with dignity rather than shame our empire. James burst into the room. 3 warships. They're demanding we hand over the princess. You have to hide me. Cathera grabbed James's arm, no longer caring about touching a human. They'll kill you if they think you've tried to bond with me. James looked at the hand on his arm, then at Cathera's face. I have a better idea. Do you trust me? Kythera hesitated for only a moment. Yes. Sarah, get her to the inner lab. I'll handle this. James turned to leave, but Kythera caught his arm again. They are elite warriors, she warned. The finest fighters in the Empire. James smiled. Good thing I'm not planning to fight them. The station's docking bay soon filled with tall, crystalline warriors, their bodies glowing with power. Their leader, Commander Varrock, stood nearly 8 feet tall, her crystal form pulsing with angry red light. Where is our princess? Varrock demanded when James met them. In our medical bay, James replied calmly. She's receiving treatment. Treatment? Varrock laughed coldly. From humans? Step aside. Little male. We will retrieve her ourselves. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. James stood his ground. She's under quarantine. The warriors stopped. In a species made of living crystal, infection was taken very seriously. Explain, Varrock demanded. We discovered a quantum resonance virus in her system. James lied smoothly, knowing the warriors wouldn't understand the science. It's why her crystal structure is failing. If you take her now, you risk infecting your entire crew. You dare to stop us with tricks. Varrock raised her weapon. James tapped his tablet, bringing up complex diagrams on the station's holographic displays. These are the virus patterns. Feel free to scan them yourself. But I should warn you, even scanning risks transmission. The warriors looked uncertainly at their commander. James pressed his advantage. Of course, we're developing a cure. That's why the princess came to us. Our quantum stabilization research is the most advanced in known space. But we need at least 3 more days. Varrock's crystal face shifted colors as she considered. You lie. Scan her then, James shrugged. But remember, if your entire crew becomes infected, who will protect the Empire? Who will tell your queen that you risked the royal guard on pride alone? The warriors shifted uncomfortably. Their commander glared at James, who met her gaze without flinching. Finally, Varrock lowered her weapon. 3 days, human. If our princess is not cured by then, we will return. And no clever words will save you. After the warriors left, James found Kythera and Sarah in the inner lab. Kythera stared at him in amazement. You outmaneuvered them, she whispered. Without violence. Without strength. Just words and wisdom. Sometimes the strongest weapon is knowing what your opponent fears, James replied. They were so afraid of appearing weak, they never questioned the science. Kythera reached out and touched his face, her crystal fingers cool against his skin. I begin to understand why the old stories warn us about humans, not because you are weak, but because your strength is different from ours. Harder to fight, harder to resist. James took her hand gently. We have 3 days now. Time enough for you to decide if that's the kind of strength you want by your side. Kythera looked at their joined hands, crystal and flesh, so different yet somehow fitting together. Perhaps I already have. The station's warning systems activated again, but this time the AI's voice held a note of awe. Imperial vessel detected. The Empress of the Valkyrian Empire requests immediate docking. James looked at Kythera, whose crystal form had grown so dim it was almost transparent in places. Your mother. She comes to stop us. Kythera's voice was barely a whisper. To prevent the shame of her daughter submitting to a human. Sarah rushed into the medical bay. The Empress's ship. It's massive. Almost the size of our entire station. Leave us, Kythera commanded, sounding like a princess again despite her weakened state. I must face my mother alone. No, James took her hand firmly. Partners, remember. We face this together. Before Kythera could argue, the medical bay doors slid open. The Empress entered, her crystal form a masterpiece of perfection. She towered over everyone, her body radiating power and authority. Where Kythera's crystal was purple, her mother's was deep red, like frozen fire. Daughter, the Empress's voice echoed through the room. What shame you bring to our line." Thera tried to stand straighter, but her weakened legs trembled. James supported her without being asked, earning a deadly glare from the Empress. "Remove your hand from my daughter, human," the Empress commanded. "No," James replied simply. The Empress's crystal form flashed with anger. "You dare." "He dares because I allow it, Mother," Thera interrupted. "Because he has earned it." "Earned it?" The Empress laughed coldly. "By being the only available option for your survival, by taking advantage of your weakness, by seeing me as an equal," Thera shot back. "By showing me that true strength isn't about dominance." The Empress moved closer, her crystal form pulsing with barely contained rage. "I give you one chance, daughter. Return home with me now. Die with dignity, as befits your station. Or remain here, bind yourself to this human, and be forever banished from the Empire." Sarah gasped. Even James felt Thera's hand tremble in his. To be banished from the Empire meant losing everything: her title, her heritage, her future throne. "Think carefully, daughter," the Empress continued. "What is your life worth? Would you trade 1,000 years of our people's tradition for a few more years of existence? Would you shame our line just to survive?" Thera looked at James, then at her mother. Her crystal form shimmered as she gathered her remaining strength. "You speak of shame, Mother," she said quietly. "But I have learned that shame lies not in submission, but in refusing to grow. Not in weakness, but in fearing change." She straightened up, despite the pain it clearly caused her. "I choose life. I choose partnership. I choose him." The Empress went very still. "Then you choose exile." "No, Mother. I choose evolution. Our people have ruled through force for too long. Perhaps it's time we learn new ways of being strong. This is your final decision." The Empress's voice was cold. Thera looked at James, who hadn't let go of her hand despite the Empress's presence, who had stood with her, supported her, respected her even when she hadn't respected him. "Yes," she said firmly. "This is my choice." The Empress turned away. "Then you are no daughter of mine. When next we meet, it will be as strangers." She walked to the door, then paused. "The genetic bond you seek, it will hurt more than you can imagine. Far more than dying with honor." "Perhaps," Thera replied. "But I won't face the pain alone." After the Empress left, Thera's legs finally gave out. James caught her, holding her close as her crystal body shuddered with silent sobs. "Was it worth it?" he asked softly. Thera looked up at him, her crystal face wet with something that looked like stars. "Ask me again after the bonding. If we survive." "When we survive," James corrected. "Partners, remember." Despite everything, Thera smiled. Partners. Time was running out. Thera lay on the medical bed, her once brilliant crystal form now almost transparent. Pieces of her continued to fall away, each lost fragment taking with it another piece of her strength. Sarah's monitors showed her life signs growing weaker by the hour. "Her core temperature is dropping," Sarah reported, her voice tight with worry. "We're losing her." James hadn't left Thera's side since the Empress's departure. He held her hand, watching helplessly as the woman he'd grown to care for literally fell apart before his eyes. "The bonding chamber is ready," Sarah said. "But James, the energy readings are off the charts. No human has ever attempted this. The risk to both of you will be worth it," Thera whispered, her voice barely audible. She tried to turn her head to look at James, but even that small movement caused more crystals to fall. "But I have to ask properly first." "Save your strength," James told her. "No." Thera's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "This must be done right. By our laws, and by my heart." With tremendous effort, Thera pushed herself up. Fragments of her crystal body scattered across the bed, but she didn't stop until she was sitting. Her eyes, once bright purple, had faded to a pale lavender. "I was wrong," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Wrong about humans. Wrong about strength. Wrong about you. She looked directly into James's eyes. Where I saw weakness, you showed wisdom. Where I expected submission, you offered partnership. Where I feared shame, you taught me pride and change. More pieces fell from her body, but she continued, her voice clear despite her failing form. I am Cythera, daughter of stars and crystal, heir to the Valkyrian Empire. And I beg you, James Martinez, to be my mate. Not because I am desperate, though I am. Not because I am dying, though I am that too. Her free hand reached up to touch his face. I beg you because you have shown me a better way to be strong. James felt tears in his eyes, but didn't try to hide them. Cythera's crystal fingers caught the teardrops, and for a moment, they sparkled like stars in her failing form. I beg you, she continued, her voice growing weaker, because in learning to submit, I found something greater than power. In losing my pride, I found, she faltered, more pieces falling away. Found what? James asked softly, supporting her as she swayed. Found love, she whispered, and with those words, her strength finally gave out. She collapsed against him, her crystal form cracking further from the impact. The chamber, Sarah shouted, now or never. James lifted Cythera's fragile form carefully. I accept, he told her as he carried her toward the bonding chamber. Not because you begged, not because you're dying, but because in teaching you about partnership, I found love too. The bonding chamber hummed with power as James laid Cythera inside. Her eyes fluttered open one last time. It will hurt, she warned him again. I know. He stepped into the chamber beside her. But we're done being afraid of pain, aren't we? As the chamber sealed around them, Cythera managed one last smile. Partners, she whispered. Partners, James agreed, taking her hand as Sarah activated the bonding sequence. The chamber filled with blinding light, and the pain began. But as darkness took them both, their hands remained clasped together, crystal and flesh, princess and scientist, two beings choosing to become one not through force or desperation, but through understanding and love. Their last conscious thought, shared between them as the bonding began, was the same. Worth it, pain. It was their whole world. Light and darkness danced behind their eyes as human DNA merged with crystal matrix. In the bonding chamber, James and Cythera's bodies glowed with intense energy, their forms barely visible through the brilliant light. Sarah watched the monitors anxiously. Their neural patterns are synchronizing, she reported to the empty room. Body temperature rising in both subjects. Inside the chamber, James felt like his body was being torn apart and rebuilt, cell by cell. But through the pain, he felt something else. Cythera's presence in his mind, her thoughts and memories mixing with his own. He saw her childhood in the Crystal Palace, felt the weight of expectations crushing down on her young shoulders. He experienced her first battle victory, tasted the bitter pride of proving herself worthy of the throne. And beneath it all, he felt her loneliness, a princess who had everything except someone to understand her. Cythera, in turn, was drowning in James's memories. She saw Earth through his eyes, felt his passion for science and discovery. She experienced his frustration at being underestimated, his quiet determination to prove his worth through intelligence rather than force. She felt his joy in small things, starlight through a window, the success of an experiment, the simple pleasure of helping others. Their pain began to change, transforming into something else. Where their bodies touched, crystal met flesh in new ways. James's skin took on a subtle shimmer, while Cythera's crystal form began to pulse with a warmth it had never known before. Impossible, Sarah whispered, staring at her readings. Their DNA. It's creating something entirely new. Inside their shared consciousness, James and Cythera reached for each other. I feel you, Cythera's thoughts whispered. Everything you are. And I feel you, James's mind responded. Your strength, your pride, your heart. The pain peaked suddenly, making them both cry out. Their bodies arched in the chamber as energy crackled around them, but their hands remained clasped, neither willing to let go. Then, just as suddenly, the pain vanished. In its place came understanding, deep, complete, and irreversible. They were no longer separate beings trying to bridge their differences. They were something new. The chamber's light began to fade. Sarah rushed forward as the door opened automatically, then stopped in amazement at what she saw. Thera's crystal form had been restored, but it was different now. Instead of the cold, hard perfection of before, her crystal body seemed to pulse with warm light. Veins of what looked like stardust ran through her form, creating patterns never before seen in a Valkyr. James had changed too. His skin held a subtle crystalline sheen, and his eyes, when they opened, had flecks of Cathera's purple in them. He looked both human and something more. Did it work? Sarah asked hesitantly. They sat up together, moving in perfect synchronization. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in a way that made Sarah shiver. "We are bonded," they said together, then smiled at the sound. Thera touched her new form wonderingly. "I can feel everything. The station's vibrations, the distant starlight. And you." She looked at James. "You're part of me now." "And you're part of me," he replied, watching the play of light across his crystalline-touched skin. "But we're still ourselves. Just more." Sarah's scanner beeped. "Your readings. They're stable. But they're like nothing I've ever seen. You're neither fully human nor fully Valkyr anymore." "We are what we chose to be," Thera said, standing with new strength. "Partners. Equals. Something new in the universe." James stood with her, their movements still perfectly matched. "The question is, what do we do now?" Thera smiled, and the expression held both her old royal confidence and new warmth. "Now, my love, we change the Empire. Together."